Good evening, everybody. I'm not going to actually put the webcam on today because I don't look like I do in that picture there. I've got a bit of a cold, so it's just slides today. So what we're going to cover today is knowing your personality type in outline. So if you could grab a piece of paper and a pen, as we go through, I'm going to be asking you to think about I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and as we go through Myers-Briggs today, I will give you some questions so you can reflect on where your preferences might lie, and I'll go on to explain that. I actually started using Myers-Briggs in 1999, so I've used it for quite some time, and I've used it with individuals and groups. And today I'd like to look at the range of type distinctions and how we can apply that and what that implies for team dynamics. It's a very useful team dynamic tool, probably more than anything else actually. I've sometimes used it for careers. I have used it in looking at teams in recruitment, but not to make a recruitment decision, but specifically, but to bring into the mix how someone might fit into a team. And then also look at some strategies for dealing with different personality types, and that's often where conflict happens. With the work that I've done with some executive MBAs, they did a course called Developing Your Managerial Competence, and it was when I was doing some work with the University of Bath. And often they found when there was conflict, there was a personality clash. And here we can look at where under stress, sometimes people have certain preferences that really come out quite strongly. And then kind of finally, to wrap up today, we're going to start to think about using awareness of type in your own team and how that might be useful. Okay, so Myers-Briggs, I noticed that some of you have used it before, but it's based on the work of Carl Jung, who believed that preferences are an innate but inborn predisposition, i.e. you're born with these. And I think the key thing here is to not be too literal with preferences. We all use both sides of our personality or different elements of our personality. But what it boils down to, or the work of Carl Jung that was then developed by Myers and Briggs, who were a mother-daughter team over the last kind of 40 years, is that we have a natural preference that feels comfortable and is kind of within us. He believed that our preferences do not change, but during our lifetime, how we use them changes. And I've seen that particularly as people get older, they can flex their preferences and try working in a different way or become more aware of how other people prefer to work. So you may find that you've done Myers-Briggs at different times in your career and it's come up with different types. And that could be because the situation you're in. Often when you do a reported type, you can, if you're under quite a lot of stress or you're thinking about it in work terms, it can come up with a different result when perhaps you're more relaxed and you're thinking more neutrally, not in terms of your home background or your work background. So the basic assumptions of type theory is that Myers-Briggs or MBTI reports on preferences. What is your preferred way of operating in the world? So it's not looking at abilities, and it doesn't tell you what you can and can't do. There are certainly no better types. I think sometimes it's misused Myers-Briggs in people say, oh, well, you have this preference, therefore you're like that, and you're better or you're worse. And people can be quite nasty sometimes about other types. But there's certainly no better types. There are pros and cons to each type or areas for development for each type and strengths for each type as well. And ultimately, people are the best judges of their own type. What we typically do with Myers-Briggs is we go through a workshop like this where you think about what your preferences are, and then you take you take a questionnaire, which is an online questionnaire. Well, sometimes it's done paper and pen as well. It's kind of now moved very much online. And you take the questionnaire and you get what's called a reported type. Now, I'm just going to ask you if you can put your hand up whether you have done a reported type. So you've gone in and done a questionnaire, probably through somebody like OPP, who is the test provider. So if you can put your hand up as to whether you've done that. Okay, let's have a look. Okay, so a few of you have, yeah, okay. And then once you've got your reported type, you can then look at what you thought what your preferences were and what the reported type was. But ultimately, often using a facilitator, you decide which one is really you. Okay, and you can go into a bit more depth with each preference and discuss that and think about it and see which is the best fit for you. So what does preference mean? It means your preferred way of working, and a good way to demonstrate that is if you take a piece of paper, so if you grab a piece of paper and a pen, and using the hand you don't normally write with, write your name. Okay. And this is like using a preference that doesn't feel right. So when you write with the hand you don't normally write with, that feels like a bit difficult. So maybe if you can just type in how you're feeling when you write with the hand that you don't normally write with. How does that feel? If you just type that in. Strange, yeah. It does feel a bit strange. And a bit awkward. So now write not good at all. Now write your name with the hand you normally write with. Okay, and how does that feel? Perfect, yeah. And that's what confident, quick, and that's how it feels when you're working with your natural preferences. So when you're working in a way that suits you. Okay? Simple. Yeah. So straightforward. It feels right. Okay. So when you're working outside your preference, that's sometimes when it can feel wrong and jarred and a bit strange. It's not black and white, and there are degrees of preference, and I'll explain that a little bit later. So sometimes you can have quite a strong preference in an area, and that can explain why certain situations and certain team members sometimes can jar or where there's conflict. It's often when there's a really strong preference within somebody. Okay. No, sorry. So it involves 4 dichotomies or opposites, and I'm going to ask you to choose your preference from each of those. Somebody's asked a question, can this change in life? Well, Carl Jung says no, that actually your preferences stay with you. And, that's one school of thought, obviously by the kind of founder of it. I would say in the work that I've done that people have, sometimes when they have a very strong preference, they can work on making it less strong, or being more balanced sometimes in their approach, or what we sometimes call it flexing your other preference or exploring that other preference. And in Myers-Briggs we call that working on your inferior preference. Okay. Yeah, my major life event can affect that, and also working in an environment that is different, and we'll look at this later, has a different preference to you. And that can actually, you kind of bend your preference to fit in sometimes, where naturally, actually, left to your own devices, you would work in a different way, or you would work, you kind of bend yourself, especially if the team has really strong different preferences to yourself. Okay. So today, as we go through this, I'm going to ask you about your preferences, so I want you to think about that. And I want you to kind of not overanalyze it too much and kind of go with what your instinct is. I think the danger sometimes with Myers-Briggs is that you can go, oh well, but in this situation I do this, and in this situation I do that, when actually what we're looking for is, okay, snap decision, what would you prefer? And that's what, when you do the reported type, that makes you do that. It's basically the reported type, for those of you who've done it, it might be a while ago, you are forced into making a decision, which is, in a way, it's making you make that snap decision. Okay. So just to refresh there, no good or bad types. It doesn't report on IQ at all, and that's why you have to be careful when using it for recruitment. It's not particularly used. A lot of big organisations use Myers-Briggs, but they don't often use it for recruitment because it doesn't measure things like numerical ability, verbal ability, or ability to do the job, technical ability. So it's reporting on preference. Okay. So, and as I said, it's not about putting you in a box. Okay, so I don't want to say you are this type. It's for you to think about that, and you may, I'm hoping that from this you'll take different things. And I want to look today at the advantages and disadvantages of each preference as we go through. So these are the main preferences. The first one is where you get your energy from. We're going to be looking at that preference. The next one is information gathering, so how you take in information. The next one is decision making, how you make decisions. And then finally one on lifestyle, how you choose to organise your life or not, as the case may be. Okay, so there are four kind of main areas we're going to look at today. So the first one is extraversion and introversion. And it's not, these words aren't kind of the street words, or you're a real party animal if you're an extrovert, or you're a quiet little mouse if you're introvert. Not at all. One of the best trainers I've ever listened to was an introvert. Had an introverted preference. And this really is looking at where you get your energy from. So people with a preference for extraversion, for those of you who know a little bit about Myers-Briggs, I'm going to go through these before, just to refresh your memory, and then move on to the team dynamic stuff. So if you have a preference for extraversion, you get your energy from outside. So you like to talk things through often. So if you have a room, meeting or a team full of extroverts, they will often talk over each other. And that can be dangerous sometimes in the way that you present ideas. Whereas introverts tend to gather their thoughts, think about things before presenting their ideas. They often need some time to reflect. There's this really funny video which I've decided not to show you because I thought it was slightly unprofessional, some of the words in it, so I won't show it to you. It's called How to Care for an Introvert, and I think particularly this is useful in relationships as well. My husband has an introverted preference, and the video is How to Care for Introverts. I don't know, Fiona, if you could just type that up for me. It's about a 9-minute video on YouTube, and I decided it was too long and maybe not that appropriate, but it is very funny, and it's about, I think it beautifully illustrates some of the videos within that, how there can be conflict with extroverts and introverts, but we'll look at that later. So extroverts tend to do, then think, then do, whereas introverts like to think, generally, do, then think. Okay, so they reflect much more, and they get their energy from inside. So this is a typical extrovert, yakking on the phone. They love to be with people. They get their energy from people. So the introverted trainer I was talking about earlier, she was a fantastic trainer, but in the evening she needed to take her own time and look after herself, and she didn't even stay at the same hotel we were staying at because she needed some time to reflect and gather her energy. So that was quite interesting. She was a brilliant trainer, but needed to know how to look after herself. This might be an introvert. in the work situation find it sometimes, people with a preference for introversion find it difficult just to be interrupted. They like to get on with something, whereas people with a preference for extraversion often welcome intrusions. And this can sometimes help explain why office environments are suited to some people and not. I think it was Google or one of the high-tech firms, Google or Microsoft, I think decided to have quiet zones within their office because all these open-plan offices were just really difficult for introverts. And I think generally the world is geared up more for extroverts and organisations are geared up more for extroverts. There's a very good YouTube clip, it's a TED lecture actually, by Susan Cain called The Power of Introverts. She's actually written a book as well about that. And that's a lovely kind of, if you're feeling, oh, sometimes I never get heard or I need to put myself forward more, and you need a bit of a boost of confidence, that's a really good YouTube video, but that's about 20 minutes, so we certainly don't have time for that. Okay. So it's not about friendliness at all. It's, it's not about that street extrovert party animal or kind of shy wallflower. Introverts still like people, and extroverts still need time out as well. So when you're thinking about type and team dynamics, think about for people with a preference for extroverts. So if you have extroverts in your team, they can often be impatient with long, slow jobs. They often work quite quickly, sometimes without thinking, and they like to have people around. I'm very excited I'm moving to an office, and I've worked by myself for a long, long time, so I probably won't shut up for the first couple of months. My preference is extraversion. People with a preference for introversion like the quiet for concentration. They tend not to mind working on one project for a long time without interruption, and they often quite like to work alone as well. They don't find that a problem. So you may find that people with a preference for extraversion are more talkative and energetic and overtly enthusiastic about the task. Sometimes people with a preference for introversion go silent when first asked a question. And I think sometimes in team dynamics, in team meetings, you can sometimes see that with people, and maybe you jump to the conclusion they don't have anything to say, but later on they come out with something really well thought through. Well, sometimes the person with a preference for extraversion has been yakking on. People with a preference for extraversion tend to answer questions immediately, whereas introverts wait to see who will answer. So when thinking about a team, it's worth thinking about the sources of stress, and we're going to look at this for all of them. So for each of these preferences, I'm going to provide an indication of where the source of stress might be for each individual. And so we can try and understand what might cause that stress for you or someone in your team who doesn't share the same preference as you, and what you can think about doing to kind of minimize that stress if it's you and you're in a team which has a different preference. So let's look at the ones for extroverts. So certainly working alone and having to communicate by email can be quite stressful for them. And long, lengthy work periods with no interruptions. And having to reflect before taking action. I think they prefer to kind of get on and do things and then work it out as they go along. And getting feedback only in writing. I remember once this happened to me. My boss, he always communicated by email and very rarely kind of sought me out to talk to me, and I found that really difficult to work with. So typical work stressors for people with a preference for introverts, working with others all the time, talking on the phone a lot, interacting with others frequently, and having to act quickly without reflection. And too much kind of verbal feedback. Sometimes they need that time to reflect. Okay. So coping with being different. Yeah, so yes, Lena has asked, could you send the slides to participants? Yes, they will be available. we can put them on our website, and you'll get a recording of this anyway as well. Absolutely, no problem, Lena. So coping with being different, if your preference is extraversion and your workplace has a more introverted preference, which is quite unusual in most kind of organisations I've worked with or within, think about networking with others outside your team, okay, so that you can get that energy from outside the team. And asking people to voice their ideas. And you know, if you're have an extroverted preference and some of your team members, maybe people you're managing, have an introverted preference, you may have to kind of ask them to draw them out a little bit. Pay attention to written notices and emails a bit more. I mean, it's easy, I think, with a preference for extroversion to not give as much attention to that as maybe verbal communication. Allowing others to think about your ideas before providing feedback. So actually one of the video clips is kind of immediately putting somebody on the spot to ask them their opinion. If people have a preference for introversion, they often can't cope with that. So if you find yourself in that type of environment, it's good to allow people to think about that. Now, if your preference is more introversion and your workplace has a more extroverted preference, then think about ways to build in a bit of quiet time. And this should give you more energy to kind of cope with it. So kind of intentionally seek out that time where you have a bit of private time and a bit of headspace. So planning breaks, the first 3 bullet points around planning breaks, really. And, you know, in meetings, sometimes you do need to think about coming up with even partially thought through perspectives to show that you're contributing. Okay, so that might help there with thinking about if you're feeling kind of out of kilter in your workplace. So I'd like you now to draw a line on your piece of paper, and on one side put extraversion, on the other side put introversion, and on that line I'd like you to put a cross where you think your preference is, having just heard me explain them, and how strong on either side you think you are. And if you're not really sure, then put a cross in the middle. Okay. So if you can just type in which one you think, if you have a strong preference for either one, do you want to just type that in and share that with the group and kind of see who we've got on the line? If we've got lots of extroverts who are dying to kind of join in the conversation, or introverts who are just kind of happy, kind of taking it all in. Balance right in the middle. Okay. Midway introvert. Okay, so we've got a range there. Okay. So the next area to look at is sensing and intuition. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm just reading the comments as I'm going along. So if you have a preference for sensing, this is, you have a present orientation. So you're looking at what's real, what's now, the facts. Okay. So, and you're very attuned with your senses, so you take all that information in. Whereas if you have a preference for intuition, you look at future possibilities, what could be, what could happen, how things might develop. Novelty, kind of insight by insight, kind of, and you very much like to kind of go with gut feelings. So it's 2 very different ways to gather information. So what I'd like you now to do is to look at this picture very quickly, and then I want you to type in the text box what you see. Okay, I'll just give you a few minutes to look at that. Okay, so what did you see? Manipulation. Mountains, path, king, puppet master, candle. Okay, so those of you with a preference for introversion may have looked at, generally what happens with this exercise is people with a preference for introversion look at the real detail. Okay, so they might look at the the landscape behind the puppets. They might say there's a candle the game hanging down at the back, maybe even start to read the words round the outside of it. People with a preference for intuition tend to look at the big picture, i.e. manipulation or puppetry, or just looking at kind of a general kind of overview of it. And they may start talking about things that are unconnected to this. Oh, they look like kind of unusual puppets. So I was on holiday recently in Germany, and I saw a puppet show, and it was a great holiday, and they go off on a tangent. So when asked to look at a picture like this, they will often make connections with things that kind of see the big picture and make other connections outside of the detail, reporting on the detail. Okay. So just to clarify on this, people with a preference for intuition are not mind readers or mystics, and people with a preference for sensing aren't overly sensitive. Okay, so that's sometimes a common misconception. And you'll gather information using both preferences. I find quite a lot of my clients find this quite difficult, this one often. But it's really what preference feels more natural. And I think sometimes in work you have to do so much of both, and perhaps you've come up through a detailed technical route, and then you start to move into managerial, you start to use maybe some more intuition preferences. So when we're looking at team dynamics, people who have sensing preference, so sensing types, seldom make errors of fact, so they're quite detailed, and they don't find that draining. I think the key thing with this is that we can often do both, but it's what drains you and what gives you energy. Sensing types like to use experience and standard ways to solve problems. They don't particularly like to experiment with new ways just for the sake of it. They like to proceed step by step, whereas intuitive types may often make errors of fact. Having to do very detailed work will often drain them. And they like to do things with quite an innovative bent, kind of that hasn't been done before. That excites them, doing something new, something innovative, and usually proceeds in kind of bursts of energy to get things done. So typical work stressors for intuitive types, if they have to attend to realities, the here and now, what's going on right now, they can find that quite stressful, or having to do things the proven way, the way it's been done before, having to check details and facts, and focus on kind of what we've learnt from the past. They like to be future orientated, and they don't particularly, generally, like to be particularly practical. I'm sure some of you can start to see how there are downsides of each preference, both in teams but also individually. So typical stressors for sensing types, they often attend to, if they have to, they don't like doing old things in new ways. You know, they don't like doing that. They don't like to as much to look at insights, gut feels. They don't go so much on that. They go much more on data and details. So that they can give overviews, but they prefer to do it with the details that back that up. They look for meanings in facts, and they don't they don't like to look for meanings in facts, particularly that can stress them, and also looking at kind of possibilities of things that can stress them as well. So too much complexity, you know, it's facts, the way we do things, kind of certainty. That is their preferred way. So when you have to work in a intuitive team or intuitive workplace and your preference is sensing, some things you can think about doing is getting involved in projects that require long-range thinking. Practice brainstorming with the rest of the team to kind of flex that preference, and prepare yourself for roundabout discussions. Look for patterns so that you're well prepared for that. And try and go beyond specifics, so try and discover meanings and themes. And these will feel sometimes quite unnatural, but if you want to feel to kind of fit in a bit more, then these are some of the things you can think about getting involved in. And similarly on the other boot, on the other foot, if your preference is intuition and your workplace is more of a sensing preference, then you may need to look at practicing presenting information in a step-by-step way, providing specific examples of vital information and honouring organisational values around experience and tradition. And then finally, reading the fine print and getting the facts straight. Because if you do a presentation that's not backed up with facts and data in an organisation that's heavily sensing preference, then that can make you basically not look very good. So I think it's also worth thinking about what preference your boss has, and have a think about that. And if you want to type that in in the box, go ahead. If you think, yeah, actually, I think, maybe not right now, as you won't know all the preferences, but towards the end, if you want to think about that, because I think that can be really useful in thinking how you interact with your main stakeholder in your career, your boss. I know, that certainly has been a tension for me in the past. So I'd now like you to draw a line on your piece of paper with sensing on one side, intuition on the other, and I'd like you to put a cross on that line where you feel your preference is. Okay, so do you want to just type that in where if you feel, yes, I've got a strong preference in. Okay, great. 83% intuitive. Okay. Maybe some of you aren't so clear on this one. Do remember we do use both, but it's which one drains our energy and which one gives us energy and feels more natural. Not so strong with this one, that's what I often find. Some of you are again in the middle. Okay. Sensing. Okay, so the next one we're going to look at is thinking and feeling. So if you have a preference for thinking, that means you like to look at things in a logical way. From an objective standpoint, you like the facts and you look at principles. You tend to be kind of firm but fair. And a good way of thinking about this sometimes is, if there's a rule at school and a child's broken it, would you ever bend the rules? Those with a preference for thinking often say, no, under no circumstances would I bend the rules. Those with a preference for feeling sometimes say, yeah, I would. In this circumstance, I probably would bend the rules. As they tend to work more from a value system, they're quite good at putting themselves in other people's shoes. So they tend to really value harmony, empathy, compassionate. It doesn't mean that they're wet in any way, okay? It doesn't mean that they're weak in any way either, but they have a different way of making decisions, or a different kind of preference. So this might be somebody with a preference for feeling, so having a good chat on the phone and having that kind of small talk conversation. Whereas this is more likely to somebody with a thinking preference. Okay, this was my old boss actually. He was like this, and I'd send him a report, and he'd send me one sentence back saying spelling mistake, page 5, and I'd panic and think I'd done a dreadful job. And when I saw him, I'd say, "Oh, how was the report?" Just thinking he must have hated it, and he'd say, "It was fine. If it was bad, I would have told you, but there was a spelling mistake on page 5." So it's quite different, because we were very. My preference is I have quite a strong preference for feeling, and his was very much on the thinking side. And actually, when I did my reported type, I actually came out thinking, although my real preference is feeling, and that's because I was working in an environment at the time that had a very strong thinking preference. So I'm going to ask you a question. Your friend's been burgled. And what do you say to them? Okay. So do you want to type that in the text box? Ah, are you okay? Tea and sympathy. Okay. One of my friends has recently been burgled, and one of her friends who has a strong preference for thinking sent a text back and said, "Did you put the alarm on?" Checking. Not how she was. And that sometimes can give you an insight into, most people with a preference for thinking tend to look at the practical realities of it. Have you secured the house? Is your insurance covering you? That kind of thing. Whereas people with a preference for feeling will often be, tea and sympathy, and are you okay? And, well, at least you weren't in when it happened, and you're still all right, and try and focus on those types of things. So to clarify, people with a preference for feeling do still think, and they are rational, and people with a preference for thinking, they still feel and they have emotions as well. Okay. When making decisions, you will apply logic and values, but your preference may have more influence. So, it's not so black and white that you're always like this or always like that, but your preference, what we're looking here as is if if you had to make that choice, where do you think you would more naturally sit? What feels more comfortable? Okay. So in terms of team dynamics, people with a preference for thinking tend to use logical analysis to reach conclusions, and they can work quite happily without harmony. They often don't need that stroking. So if you've got a team that has quite a few people with feeling preference in that, you may need to work a bit harder to bring about that harmony and that team spirit, because that's how people with a preference for feeling often like to be appreciated. So people with a preference for thinking look at the principles involved in the situation and feel rewarded when their job is done well. That's kind of enough for them. Whereas people with a preference for feeling feel rewarded when people's needs are met. That often gives them great satisfaction. They often use their values to reach conclusions, and they work best in harmony with other people. So when it's they don't like conflict often, and they will back away from conflict, and that can be a negative. But with each of these, you can probably think of, in the workplace, there are things that are that can be detrimental to your career on each of these. So when thinking about work stress for thinking types, they typically get stressed when using personal experience to assess situations, when they have to adjust to individual differences and needs, and when they have to kind of notice and do all that positive stroking on processes and people. So they don't like as much to use empathy and personal values to make decisions. And again, having others react to questioning as divisive feels very stressful. That they would see that as often perfectly reasonable to ask those types of questions. Similarly, kind of work stresses for feeling types can be when they have to analyse situations objectively, when they can't use that value system to help them analyse the situation, when they have to set criteria and standards, and when they have to critique and focus on flaws and not look at the positives. I sometimes find giving feedback at interview quite difficult, things that people need to work on, especially if there's a lot of things. So focusing on tasks only can feel stressful, and when they have to use logic, and when they're forced to ask questions that can seem kind of divisive. So to cope with being different, if you have an environment, perhaps you're in a team which has more of a feeling preference and your preference is thinking, then think about maybe working on projects which where their alternative causes and solutions are evaluated in personal terms. Okay, and reminding yourself that actually factoring the impact on other people is logical, even if people aren't logical. You may want to think about softening critical remarks and finding the positive, and we call it feedback sandwich. So look at what's good, what needs to be worked on, and then finish on a positive. And then asking for people's opinions and concerns rather than kind of steamrolling through, even if you've decided what you're going to do, but going through that process. Looking for points of agreement before discussing issues so that people feel involved. And similarly, on the other side, if your preference is feeling and your workplace is more of a thinking preference, then practice laying out arguments logically. You can do that to, I suppose, fit in a bit better with your team or kind of make your team gel a bit better. So kind of use that other preference, so kind of testing that out. Understanding that critical feedback is often given in the spirit of improving your professionalism, and that's why it's valuable. Bringing attention to stakeholders' concerns regarding projects and work, and using brief, concise language to express your wants and needs. Okay. So again, I'd like you to draw a line. Okay. And then put the cross on that line and type in where you feel your preference is. Lenka says, I'm quite strong on feeling aspect, although being quite rational, especially during crisis management or problem solving. Yeah, when you're required to move into the different preference. Okay, so that's a really good example of you need sometimes to work in the other preference. Okay, few in the middle, quite a strong thinker, feeling, totally. Okay, good. What kind of lifestyle do you prefer is the last piece, so how you organise yourself. If you have a preference for judging, you like to be in control, you often write a lot of lists, you like to be organised, set goals and be a planner. Whereas if you have a preference for perceiving, you like to kind of go with the flow a bit more, adapt, let life happen, be kind of less trying to control things all the time and kind of more flexible. So if you think about how you go about having a holiday, that can sometimes, it's a question sometimes I ask to see if people, how they go about having a holiday. So I'd be interested to know if you want to type in, how do you plan your holidays, or do you just kind of rock up and see, kind of go with the flow? My preference is judging, so I like to plan. I'm always thinking about next year's holidays, next summer holidays. I can't bear it if I turn up and it's not what I wanted, because I will just berate myself for the whole of the holiday because I should have done my research and found out that the beach was miles away from where we were staying or whatever. So I'm very much have a judging preference. Great. A few people are pack in the evening before. Yeah, I'm totally a planner. Last minute, go with the flow. Bit of a planner. Somebody at a workshop once said, I actually get my other friend to organise it all the time. Okay. So this might be somebody who has a preference for judging. They're perfectly organised for a spontaneity session. And somebody with a preference for perceiving. Hate being closed off. Often I find I work with people with a preference for perceiving don't like to be tied into a decision. Okay, we don't have time to do that one. But J doesn't mean you're judgmental of stuff, judgmental. And having a preference for perceiving doesn't mean you're perceptive. People with a preference for judging can adapt to change. And people with a preference for perceiving, they'll meet their deadlines. It doesn't mean they won't meet their deadlines. And when I worked with a creative team a couple of years ago, and they all had a preference for perceiving, and I was trying to put things in their diary. I used to drive them mad. I'd kind of do a quiet, sneaky project plan and try and plan those milestones, and then put them in their diary and put meetings in with me to talk about the milestones, and they just couldn't bear it. But it didn't mean they didn't get things done, but it looked to me like they weren't going to get it done because I kind of needed to be more organised. So on that line, if you can write again, having talked a little bit around judging and perceiving, where you think your preference is, judging and perceiving, and then type it in. to the box. So if you know where you think you are, a strong judging, 91% perceiver. Okay. Fredora, it sounds like you've actually done the reported type and you're typing that in, I presume. Judging, okay, perceiving. It's got a real mix, okay. So Fiona's just going to do a poll now on which is more like you. The first one is A, I get my work done and then I play. And B is I play first, then I get my work done. Okay. So if you could answer that question in the poll, and then Fiona will post that up. See what we've got. While we're doing that, I will just carry on with team dynamics. So people with a preference for judging work best when they can plan their work. They like structure, schedules. People with a preference for perceiving enjoy that flexibility in work. They like to leave things open for last-minute changes. And they'll often postpone decisions when searching for options. And this can cause conflict, like I just kind of explained about the creative types I was working with. You do get creative types who have a preference for judging, but they just happen to be all very artistic, interestingly. Okay, we've got the results, and 64 people say I get my work done first, and then I play, and that's very much more likely to have a preference for judging. And those 23 of you who I play and then I get my work done, more likely to have a preference for perceiving. Okay. So sometimes this can cause stress and conflict in the workplace for judging types. If you're always waiting for a structure to emerge, if it all seems very fluid around time frames and deadlines, that can be very stressful, and that's worth thinking about in terms of your teams and the people that you work with. And having to marshal your energy at the last minute, because I had a client recently actually who was very kind of a last minute man, and myself and the other trainer were so stressed out because that's not the way that we'd worked, and we'd set a time scale with deadlines, and he just ignored that, and bless him. He was a lovely guy, but just really strong on perceiving, and just was quite happy to kind of change all the slides and add all sorts of stuff at the last minute, which just we found massively stressful. So they don't particularly like dealing with surprises. Whereas, on the other hand, typical work stresses for perceiving types might be having to get organised and plan and time frames and deadlines, and it's quite annoying that people are distrustful of that last minute energy. So they don't really like to have to do lots of planning. So they will resist that, which is again worth thinking about for your team. So again, if your preference is judging and your workplace is more perceiving, maybe you need to kind of align yourself or find work within the firm, or suggest work, or put forward yourself for projects that have definite milestones and a final deadline. And maybe try and delay some decisions so that it gives you the chance to put in that extra information. And understand that work is progressing despite differences in working style. And make your own milestones and deadlines if you're working in that type of environment. Similarly, if your preference is perceiving and your workplace is more judging, you can look at these to help you, recognise that deadlines set by the organisation may not be negotiable. Using a past decision you believe others rushed into to demonstrate the advantages of slowing down to gather more information, perhaps being more planned, and becoming active in projects where the process is important as the outcome, and keeping those surprises to a minimum, especially if a lot of your team is judging. That will reduce the conflict within the team. Okay, so if you now look at that piece of paper that you've just done and estimate what your type might be, and then type it in the text box. Great. ENFP. Okay, I'll let you do that. Okay, great. ENFP, ISFJ. Okay. So those are the 16 types. And we've prepared a kind of handout on our website, and I'll show you how to access that. So you can go and read that in a bit more detail. And if you're not sure about, maybe there's a couple of ones you're not sure about, this can be useful to read through and think which one's more like me. That might help to look at those 16 types. And I just put this in for fun. As kind of, we're not going to go through them all, but some kind of high-level characteristics of certain types. Okay. So what does this mean in terms of teams? Basically, it's worth looking in terms of are the right people in the right kind of job, because any type can potentially perform any job, but and few jobs will fit personality preferences perfectly. However, the more preferences that fit, the more satisfying work will be for people within teams, and your work will be. So if sometimes you're not, somebody said then, my mum says I'm a cheeky monkey and you put a nice owl, I will report to her on that. Okay. So in terms of getting your team doing the right types of jobs, I think that's particularly useful for MBTIs when you're allocating work to people that you're working with, or you're thinking about your own work, and perhaps why it's not working so well for you is to try and delegate those things that are outside your preferences, so that you can use more of your preferences, because it will give you more energy, it will feel more enjoyable. And I suppose that's, I use this sometimes with career coaching to get people to think about what their real strengths are. Okay, and when they're working outside their preferences too much, it can feel draining, and that can feel, unsatisfactory. Okay, so it's worth thinking about how does your type contribute to the team. What are the pitfalls of your type, and doing some research on that. And a good question to ask is, what would the organisation be like if it were run entirely by people who shared your preferences? Maybe if you can type that in, if I asked you that question, what would the organisation be like that you work for if it were run entirely by people who shared your preferences? Okay, so I think, working hell, says Robert Groom. Nothing would get done, Paul again. Lenka says perfect. Chaotic, says Andrew Piper. Excellent. Okay. So what are your next steps? Okay. You might want to think about delivering feedback that caters to your type. Okay. So I've just put a little bit of information here about giving feedback. A lot of companies are doing 360 feedback or do 360 feedback. So if you know the type of the person that you are, or you think you know the type of the person you're giving feedback to, then it can help, if it's somebody who has a preference for extraversion, then discussing that with either you or a peer may be necessary for them. Somebody with a preference for introversion may need some time to reflect and take that in. Somebody with a preference for judging, getting them doing an action plan and securing that commitment to change, whereas someone with a preference for perceiving likes that flexibility in determining the next step. So there's some things to think about there if you have to give any kind of feedback to people, and being aware of their type. Okay. I find, I know some of you are doing mentoring and getting involved in mentoring, and I think it's useful as a useful coaching tool to know the preferences of the person that you're coaching, and I often use it for that as a kind of kick-off to help me understand where their preferences lie, and that helps me coach them better. So in summary, MBTI is valuable for all these reasons. I think it's particularly useful for looking at teams. I know some of the exec MBAs I worked with, they found it very useful in thinking about, they got everybody on their team to do MBTI and then mapped that and saw where the gaps were, because actually a balanced team can bring a lot of value. If you have all extroverts and you've got no one taking their time to think about things, that can have some disadvantages. So really worth thinking about that in terms of building your team and the person, or the people that you're working with. And certainly in recruitment, when I wouldn't use it as a yes/no decision for recruitment, but certainly useful for thinking about, okay, so if we both have these similar types, where's the danger here? Where's the risk here in our organisation or in our team? Okay. So it's a helpful tool. It's a helpful tool. It's not the be all and end all. And here's some suggesting reading and sources of further information. Okay. And please, if you would like to kind of talk to us or communicate with us, we're on Twitter at The Career Farm or Facebook at The Career Farm. Any kind of final questions as we close off for the evening? Thank you for asking questions as you've gone along. Lenica says, I've never experienced MBTI in the companies I have worked for. And do I see this really being implemented? I know from the people that I've worked with that they have found it useful when thinking about team. Even if you went through my slides with people and got them to even talk about where they feel their preferences are, if you could even just do that as a kind of discussion point to look at the different ways that people work. So I know a lot of companies do use it, but if you haven't, not every company does. It's just another useful tool. One question here. The slides will be available. Oh, I don't know what's happened there.
That's me. You see my whiteboard. Hopefully everybody can see the
yes.
title for the YouTube.
There we go. Ah, that's the YouTube video.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you. That's the one I was too scared to put on, so you go on and have a laugh now. And that's where the website address is for the handout on those 16 types, so you can read a little bit about more about different types. Someone said.
Robert's asked the question. I don't know if that's the one that you're looking for.
Robert, that's what I was looking for. Should you structure your CV around your preferences? No. There's certainly a structured way to do your CV. Well, we're not going to do a CV webinar here, but achievements, responsibilities, not your preferences. I mean, CVs tend to be evidence-based, so it needs to be. I suppose if you think about it, people want to see evidence of things, not necessarily kind of subjective thought. So, I always laugh when people say I'm a brilliant communicator or whatever. It's just kind of worthless because that's what they think. It's not evidenced. If you want to bring out that skill, say you presented to the board or you presented at this or that, and this was the outcome. Okay, but good question.
They should be evidence. Can you see the question from Paula at the bottom? If you can't, I'll read it out for you. Can it be used for planning next steps in career moves? I'm looking to move. I'm looking at the next organisation and wondered if I could think about fitting my MBTI type.
Yeah, I think I definitely think in terms of an organisation, thinking about what the personality is of that organisation and how they work. And once you've been offered a job, you can go in and maybe spend, some time there to get a sense of that. Is it all open plan? Is it all very kind of detailed? What is that? It's quite difficult to find that out without working there. But I think in terms of your career development, it's very useful for career development because you can see where your preferences are and whether the next job would help you utilise those preferences even more.
Rachel just asked, you referred to another YouTube video. She just wondered what the name was again.
Yes. That's Susan Cain, C-A-I-N, and it's The Power of the Introvert.
I'll just put that up actually while we're waiting.
Yeah, and it's a TED lecture actually. So the webinar recordings are on this website, workmaze.com, business schools, and the username is OUBS and passwords SBUO. Okay, and the next webinar we've got is Jessica Price-Jones. Moving along. And she's going to be talking about happiness at work, maximising your psychological capital for success. And she's done loads and loads of research about maximising happiness for you and your workplace. And she's going to talk about the research and the 5 components that build your happiness at work and help you achieve your potential. So actually that question about career development, that would be a very useful webinar to go to. So it seems to be a hot topic at the moment, happiness, and so it's what we all strive for. So I hope, okay, Fiona's sorting that out. I hope you've enjoyed this evening. If you have any further questions, please just send me, drop me an email, and Fiona can just pop my email on there, if that's okay, Fiona, on the whiteboard. Brilliant. And okay, Fedor's found that he can now get into the website. Great. Okay, that's good. Okay, so please go ahead and download the handout. And I hope you enjoyed this evening, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one in January. So I just take this moment to wish you a happy Christmas and a very happy New Year. Good evening.
Yes, the same from me. Look forward to seeing you all next year. Thanks a lot.
Okay.